My name is Dr. Alara Vance. For 15 years, I was the Chief Investment Architect for Capital Nexus. That title, like most in the corporate world, was designed to obscure rather than explain. What it meant was that I built the cage where they kept their dragons. Capital Nexus didn't trade in stocks or bonds. They traded in the illiquid and the impossible. Picassos, Duesenbergs, and forgotten French chateaux. My job was to turn these physical, one-of-a-kind treasures into secure, verifiable digital assets. My office was my sanctuary. It was an oasis of analog calm on the 42nd floor. While the rest of the firm buzzed with the frantic energy of open plan layouts and glass walls, my space had a solid oak door. On my desk, a vintage Pelican fountain pen with a custom-ground nib rested next to a leather-bound journal. Its pages were filled with the elegant architecture of code, system logic sketched out in flowing dark green ink. My keyboard was a quiet, mechanical marvel, but my most important work began on paper. Beside my monitor, a simple white ceramic mug, chipped at the rim from a long-forgotten accident in my doctoral days, held a perpetually cooling cup of single-estate oolong tea. These were the tools of my trade. They were real. They had weight. The system I built was called the Valerius Protocol. The board just called it the Vault. To them, it was a glorified inventory list, a digital ledger that told them what they owned and where it was. What they didn't understand was that Valerius wasn't a ledger. It was a fortress. Each physical asset was linked to a unique, immutable smart contract on a private blockchain I designed from the ground up. The protocol contained every asset's life story, its provenance, its restorations, its chain of title, all cryptographically secured and legally binding. It was my life's work. It allowed a firm of glorified salesmen to trade in history with the speed of a keystroke and the security of a mountain. I built it with one hidden feature, a lesson learned in the ashes of another company. Years ago, I watched a brilliant firm, Etheria Capital, get gutted by a new CEO chasing a fleeting dot-com trend. He sold off stable foundational assets to buy vapor, and the entire structure collapsed. I swore I would never let that happen to something I had built. So, deep in the charter of the Valerius Protocol, buried in the legal boilerplate that no executive ever reads, was Article 9, Section 4. It was a dead man's switch, a conscience for the machine. It was designed to protect the assets not from outside hackers, but from the transient, destructive whims of the people in charge. It was my moral foundation, written in code. It was a legacy. Then, Leo Sterling arrived. She was the CEO's niece, a 28-year-old supernova of entitlement and poor fashion choices. Her official title was Digital Asset Curator, a role she clearly invented. She wore Balenciaga sneakers that looked like orthopedic corrective shoes for a small robot and carried handbags so small they served no purpose other than to declare their own expense. Her fatal flaw, the one that would unravel everything, was a profound and arrogant ignorance. She genuinely believed that knowing the jargon was the same as having the knowledge. The humiliation started small, tiny paper cuts to my professional dignity. A week after her arrival, she called a meeting to discuss the Valerius Protocol's user interface. She projected it onto the main screen, a clean, data-rich display I had designed for clarity and precision. Okay, so the UX here is like super clunky, she began, gesturing vaguely at the screen. It's not user-centric. We need to gamify the dashboard, make it more intuitive, like a social media feed. Something with dynamic tiles, maybe an infinity scroll. I kept my expression neutral. The protocol's interface is designed for lawyers and asset managers, Leo. It prioritizes data integrity and traceability, not engagement metrics. An infinity scroll would be functionally useless. She gave Marcus, her uncle, a look of profound pity, as if I were a hopelessly lost cause. What Alara is saying, she said, her voice dripping with condescension, is that she's more focused on the back-end legacy code than the front-end user journey. We need to be agile and pivot our UI/UX strategy to better align with our brand's digital-first ethos. Marcus, who couldn't tell a user journey from a travel itinerary, just nodded sagely. Good thinking, Leo. Let's explore that. I watched as he was swayed not by logic, but by the confident delivery of meaningless jargon. The rot was already setting in. Her first major proposal was to fractionalize ownership of a vintage Bugatti. My report on the matter was 17 pages of dense, unavoidable legal facts. In our meeting, she didn't even pretend to read it. "Okay, so just distill it down to a one-pager for me," she said, her thumb swiping furiously across her phone screen. "I'll get the vibe." I slid the report back into my folder. "The vibe," I said, my voice perfectly level, "is that if we follow your plan, we expose the firm to 3 different kinds of securities fraud and invalidate the car's insurance policy." She looked up, a flicker of annoyance in her eyes. "You're getting bogged down in legacy frameworks. We need to synergize our deliverables in a more frictionless Web3 first paradigm." It was like listening to a machine that had been fed a dictionary of business buzzwords and was now vomiting them back up in a random order. She would refer to the Valerius Protocol, my fortress, as Ilara's little spreadsheet. She would interrupt my technical explanations in board meetings to translate them, always getting the core concepts spectacularly wrong. She wasn't just incompetent, she was actively hostile to competence itself. She saw my experience not as a resource, but as a bug in her shiny new system. The end came in the main boardroom. The room was all glass and brushed steel, a cold cathedral of commerce. Leo stood before a 90-inch screen presenting her grand vision. It was a garish, animated NFT of The Serpent's Kiss, the firm's most prized painting. The digital version blinked and pulsed with a tacky neon glow. "Physicality is a bug, not a feature," she declared to the assembled executives. "We're spending millions on storage for all this. Boomer wealth. It's time to unlock the liquidity of this static asset and synergize its value in the digital space." When she finished, my boss, her uncle Marcus Sterling, turned to me. "Ilara, your assessment." I stood. I didn't need a presentation. The facts were my allies. Tokenizing the painting would create a derivative asset with no legal claim on the physical work. It would permanently sever the painting's provenance, making it unsellable on the legitimate art market. You would not be unlocking its value. You would be destroying the very thing that gives it value. The room was silent. I had presented an irrefutable logical case. It was also completely irrelevant. Leo smirked, a small, cruel twist of her lips. "Okay, Boomer," she said, loud enough for the junior executives near her to let out nervous little chuckles. "Thanks for the history lesson. But we're not running a museum." She then looked directly at Marcus. Her voice was pure steel. "She's a roadblock. Her thinking is fundamentally incompatible with the future. It's her, or progress." This was it. The moment of betrayal. Marcus, a man whose entire fortune was secured by the protocol I had built, refused to meet my gaze. He looked at his polished mahogany table. "Ilara, we appreciate your service," he mumbled, "but the board has decided to move in a new direction." I felt a strange calm settle over me. The fury that had been slowly building for weeks cooled into something hard and clear, like ice. As I gathered my notes, my hands perfectly steady, Leo leaned in close. Her voice, a triumphant whisper, meant only for me. "Don't worry, we'll take it from here." Then she turned to the room, her voice ringing with performative pity. "You're dead weight." The execution was complete. They had no idea what they had just done. They thought they were firing an employee. They were actually arming a weapon. My exit was the quietest event on the 42nd floor that day. I didn't shout. I didn't plead. I returned to my office, the hushed whispers of my colleagues following me down the hall. I looked at the oasis I had built for myself. I packed my box with a deliberate, almost ceremonial slowness. The chipped mug, a symbol of my long journey, the Pelican pen, the instrument of my logic, the worn first edition of The Count of Monte Cristo that I kept on my shelf, a story about a long, patient, and perfectly executed revenge. Everything else, the monitors, the industry awards, the technical manuals I had written, was just company property. They were welcome to the shell. I was taking the soul. As I walked to the elevator, my dignity my only shield, I didn't look back. At the front security desk, a young guard with nervous eyes took my badge. He fumbled with it for a moment, then swiped it through the deactivation terminal. A small red light blinked. My access to Capital Nexus was officially revoked. What he didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that he wasn't just locking me out. He was locking them in. That simple electronic act was the final prerequisite of Article 9, Section 4, the deactivation of the architect's credentials. The trap was now live. All it needed was for the mouse to take the cheese. My apartment smelled of old paper and bookbinder's glue. It was my sanctuary, a world away from the sterile glass and steel I had just left behind. There were no frantic calls to headhunters, no desperate updates to my resume. My revenge was already in motion. The preparations had been made 15 years ago. For the next 2 days, I did what I loved. I worked on restoring a beautiful, battered copy of a 19th century astronomical atlas. The leather on the cover was cracked and dry. I carefully treated it with a special oil, my fingers working the balm into the ancient hide. This was my philosophy in miniature. True value wasn't created in a flash of inspiration. It was preserved through patient, meticulous work. You couldn't just declare something valuable. You had to understand its structure, respect its history, and protect it from decay. Leo, in her ignorance, was a form of decay. I was the preservationist. I repaired a tear in a star chart of the Orion constellation with a piece of archival tissue paper, my movements patient and precise. I sipped my oolong tea from my chipped mug and felt a deep, quiet satisfaction. It was the calm of a master strategist who has already seen the checkmate, 5 moves ahead. I was simply waiting for my opponent to make their inevitable, fatal error. I knew it wouldn't take long. Pride and incompetence are always in a hurry. The call I was expecting never came. The news arrived the way everything does now, through the cold, impersonal glow of a screen. A headline on a financial news site just 48 hours after my termination. Capital Nexus portfolio, frozen amid unprecedented system glitch. A glitch. I almost laughed. I later heard from a former colleague what it was like on the inside. The chaos was apparently a sight to behold. Leo had gathered her team of sycophants in the main conference room. A bottle of champagne was on ice. She made a speech, something about disrupting legacy assets. Then, with a flourish, she clicked execute. For a moment, nothing happened. Then every screen in the legal department turned red. Peterson, the head lawyer, was the first to see it. He thought it was a drill. But the notifications weren't system errors. They were formatted like court summons. Official notice of asset title reversion. Dozens of them, then hundreds. A cascading flood of legal alerts, one for every single asset in the firm's portfolio. His phone began to ring. Then every phone in the department began to ring. The firm's general counsel stormed in, his face the color of ash, screaming something about a hostile takeover. But it wasn't a takeover. It was a perfectly executed legal maneuver, triggered from the inside. I had built this system with one hidden feature. The Valerius Protocol was not designed to produce error messages. Errors imply failure. My system did not fail. It acted. I watched his world collapse in real time. Not just Leo's, but Marcus's. The beautiful, brutal, immutable truth of the blockchain log showed her user ID as the sole trigger. There was no ambiguity, no one else to blame. The technology Leo claimed to master had become her judge, jury, and executioner. The look on his face, my colleague said, when he realized his own niece had just legally stolen his entire company, was a masterpiece of quiet horror. For a full day, there was chaos. The financial press was in a frenzy. Investors were screaming down the phone lines. The company was paralyzed. A multi-billion-dollar ghost ship, adrift and powerless. Then my phone rang. The caller ID read, Marcus Sterling. I let it ring 3 times. I took a slow sip of my tea. Then I answered, my voice perfectly calm. Ilara Vance. Ilara, what did you do? His voice was a raw, ragged thing, stripped of all its usual executive polish. It was the sound of pure panic. I felt a sliver of cold, perfect satisfaction. I did nothing, Marcus, I said, turning a page in my book. I am no longer with the company. It appears a reckless action was attempted on the portfolio. A reckless action? The whole company is frozen. Ilara, we've worked together for 15 years. You have to help me. Fix it. His appeal to loyalty was pathetic. It was a currency he had devalued himself. The system I designed to protect the assets from such an event protected them, I continued, my voice as level as a frozen lake. It is functioning perfectly. The Valerius Protocol is operating exactly as specified in the foundational charter you signed 15 years ago. You should have read it. It's all in there. I'll pay you anything, a bonus, a new contract. Just reverse it. This was the moment, the checkmate. I no longer have the authority, Marcus, I said simply. The assets are now under the legal stewardship of the Vance Integrity Trust. I suggest you have your lawyers contact theirs. I ended the call. I did not slam the phone down. I pressed the red icon on the screen with a quiet finality. I left him there, in a silence more damning and more complete than any tirade I could have ever delivered. The surrender came 2 days later. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a dictation of terms. My lawyer, a shrewd old man named Arthur, who had helped me set up the trust years ago, met with the terrified board of Capital Nexus. He told me later they looked like men who had seen a ghost. They started by offering me a generous severance package. Arthur simply smiled. By the end, they were begging. The final terms were absolute. First, Leo Sterling was to be terminated immediately. Her termination would be accompanied by a public press release, naming her as the sole party responsible for the portfolio security incident due to gross mismanagement and catastrophic incompetence. Second, my victory would not be a simple return. I didn't want my old job back. A new C-suite position was to be created by order of the trust, Chief Portfolio Arbiter. This role would have a permanent, unbreakable contract and sole, final, and irrevocable authority over the management and disposition of every company asset. I could not be overruled. Marcus Sterling would remain as CEO, a figurehead in a suit, but his power was gone. I would hold the scepter. I would be the real power at Capital Nexus. They agreed to everything. They had no choice. I saw Leo one last time. I was walking down the hallway toward my new, larger corner office when the elevator doors opened. She was standing inside, holding a small cardboard box filled with the detritus of her failed career. A crypto-themed t-shirt, a ridiculously small handbag, a sad-looking succulent. Her trendy sneakers looked absurd. Her face, once a mask of smug confidence, was pale and hollow. She was a digital native, utterly defeated by the hard, tangible reality of the world she had so arrogantly dismissed. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. I gave her nothing. No smirk, no pity, no acknowledgement at all. I simply walked past, leaving her to descend into the obscurity she so richly deserved. My new office was magnificent. It had a view that stretched all the way to the horizon. On the vast, empty mahogany desk, I placed my things, my Pelican pen, my leather journal, and my chipped ceramic mug. They looked perfectly at home. Later that afternoon, a courier delivered a document, the finalized charter for the Vance Integrity Trust, now the legal oversight body for Capital Nexus. I turned to the mission statement, the part Arthur and I had written all those years ago. The Trust's primary mission, now funded by a percentage of Capital Nexus's profits, was to provide grants for the preservation of historical artifacts, rare books, and analog art forms. The very legacy Leo had called dead weight was now the moral and financial core of the company. The dead weight now protected the legacy. I brewed a pot of oolong tea. I poured it into my old familiar mug. I stood at the window, watching the city lights begin to glitter in the twilight, and I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip. The victory was complete. It was personal, and it was mine.